get confirmation there. Great.
Here we go.
So welcome everybody to the December edition of our Theoretical Statistical Ecology group seminar. We have the pleasure of having here Rebecca Tyson from University of British Columbia, Okanagan or Okanagan?
Yeah.
Okanagan.
Okanagan, thank you very much. And she will be presenting work between herself and her collaborators, Maria Martignoni and Jimmy Garnier, on stable multi-partner mutualisms. So thank you very much, Rebecca, for accepting your invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. This is really pretty exciting. It's always a privilege to be able to share my work with people I don't normally run across. This photo here is one that I took in the mountains near where I live. And what we see there is a profusion of different kinds of wildflowers. The orange ones are Indian paintbrush, the blue is lupin, and the white is yarrow, and then there's some other flowers in there that are too small to distinguish. But I took it as an illustration of two very common mutualisms, or mutualisms that we know about. One of them is plant pollinator mutualisms. So most of us are familiar with the notion that bees visit flowers, transferring pollen from one flower to another, and thereby allowing the flowers to produce seed. The other mutualism is underground, and that we know that plants are connected by a large network of fungal mycelia that work in concert with the plants. It's a mutualistic relationship where the fungi help the plants and the plants help the fungi. And so this is going to be an image that appears a few times just to help anchor the talk as I go through it. Before I get to the research, I'd like to introduce my collaborators to you. And actually, I made a mistake on the first slide. I should have listed three names in addition to mine. So Maria Martignoni is on the left. This is her work, her PhD work. She is now a postdoc at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Israel. Jimmy Garnier is a professor in the Centre National de Recherche in France, at Université Savoie-Mont-Blanc. And Miranda Hart is the biologist, and she's the one who has the data. And she's at my campus. I also want to thank my research support. In particular, I want to acknowledge that I am grateful to live and work on the traditional unceded territory of the Syilx Okanagan peoples of this part of the world. Okay, so mutualisms. And in fact, we're interested in particular in multi-partner mutualisms. So a bit of background here. Multi-partner mutualism means that there are lots of organisms coexisting, as I showed you in that photo at the beginning, which means that we need to deal with what we know about competition. So as soon as you've got a whole lot of species existing together, you expect that there's going to be competition. Competition for space, competition for light, competition for nutrients, etc. However, way back, as far back as 1930, and perhaps even earlier, we have this statement that two species sharing the same resource cannot coexist at constant population levels. So as soon as one becomes a slightly better competitor or slightly better at getting resource, it outcompetes the other one, and you're left with just one. And this has been shown in a number of different ways. Quickly here, we can look at the straightforward Lotka-Volterra model for competition. What I've got here is the non-dimensionalized form. So the carrying capacity has been, the A parameter contains the carrying capacity and the growth rate. So these other parameters are just one in this frame. But we have, you notice these, can you see my mouse?
Yeah, we can see the mouse. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so this part here, that's logistic growth of species 1. And then the U1 times minus A1 to U2, this is the competition between U1 and U2. And then we have the same, exactly the same form for species 2. So here's the logistic growth, and then here's the negative effect of competition. And so if we want to understand this model, the first thing we might do is look for the null-clines. So that's setting the derivatives to 0. And we find that the axes, u1 and u2, are both null-clines. And then we have these two straight lines that are also null-clines. And so if we plot these, so the axes are null-clines, and then we have two straight lines which might intersect, as shown in the top left, or the top right, or they might not intersect, as shown down here. The steady states are the black circles. So we can have two steady states. Oh, there's one at 0 that didn't get included in this figure. There's a steady state at 0, but there are also these steady states here, where you have just one species. So this is U1 takes over, and this one is U2 takes over. Same scenario here, and then these two scenarios at the top, we have these single species states, and there's one coexistence state. No coexistence is possible in these scenarios down here. Coexistence is possible theoretically, given the steady states in these two scenarios, but in the one on the right, this is an unstable steady state. So you end up with one species or the other, depending on where you start. So we can have coexistence here, but if we look at all the possible cases for this competition parameter, the different configurations we can end up with, most of the time we end up with what's called competitive exclusion, where only one species survives. So mathematically, and this is simply one example, mathematically any competition model that does not differentiate between the species arrives at this conclusion. However, in nature, competitive exclusion seems to be rare. So then we need to ask ourselves, how does it happen? And there are many mechanisms that have been looked at theoretically. Most of them involve raising the dimensionality of the system. So you can create niche differences. So maybe these two species, U1 and U2, looked like they were pretty much the same, but there were some differences in the way they accessed resource or in the part of the resource they were using. And so they're able to separate their competition a little bit. There's the competition colonization trade-off, where one species that is a really good competitor might not be as good a colonizer. So the colonizer can get ahead of the competitor and can get established, and then when the competitor moves in, the colonizer can move somewhere else. In this way, in a spatial domain, these two can coexist. Spatial heterogeneity is another way. You can have the actual physical domain be different through space. Trophic interactions, so now we've added other levels to our so not just the resource and the two competitors, but maybe there's another one. This can also allow competitors to coexist. There are other mechanisms. This is a sampling of the ways in which we can mathematically find coexistence of multiple competitors. Now, what about mutualisms? So this is from a paper by Johnson and Bronstein in 2019. Coexistence is impossible when competitors compete solely for a shared partner-provided commodity, because superior competitors deplete that commodity sufficiently to exclude inferior competitors. This is essentially a restatement of the competitive exclusion principle, but just reframed in the context of mutualisms. So if you have a whole bunch of mutualists sharing the resources provided by one partner, these mutualists, the assumption is these mutualists are competing, and we're going to end up with just one of those coexisting with the partner. However, as with the straight competition scenarios, there are lots of mutualisms out in nature with multiple partners. In particular, the examples I showed you at the very beginning, the plant pollinator mutualisms and the plant fungal mutualisms. So theoreticians have been trying to understand how you can have multiple mutualistic partners coexisting on one host. One possible way is that these mutualists might be influencing partners in a way that benefits the competitors. There can be in the soil, for example, one fungus might change the properties of the soil in a way that benefits another fungus, or might induce the plant to do something to the soil that benefits other competitors. That's a fairly complex mechanism. Another one that is very popular is the notion of partner selection. And what partner selection means is that if you're good to me, I'll be good to you. And in that way, you can have multiple mutualists. So the mutualists who don't give much are only given a little back. The mutualists who give a lot are given a lot back. In the ecological literature, this results in adaptive foraging, for example. So if you think of bees, they would spend more time on the flowers that give them more nectar or more pollen, and less time on the flowers that give them less. And then there can also be specialization developing. So if they become really specialized, then you can end up with, it becomes a little bit like the competitive exclusion, where you just end up with one mutualist host partnership, but you can have several of these in the same area. Now, multi-partner mutualisms, if we know they exist, right? We know that there are lots of bees visiting the same flowers. We know that there are lots of fungi visiting or coexisting with the same plants. But we don't know for sure that the mechanisms I listed previously are actually present. In particular, the partner selection mechanism, which is a very popular one, the idea that if you give me lots, I give you lots, is a very popular one. However, we're not convinced it exists. So let me give you a little bit of biology here. So the fungi in the ground that associate with plants are called Arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, or AMF for short. So I've got a little sketch here showing how it works. This is a plant. The plant is able to take the energy from the sun and turn it into and use it to fix carbon through photosynthesis. This carbon then is used in the plant through the leaves and other parts of the plant, but also is sent down to the roots. And once it's in the roots, these fungi, what the fungi do is they grow through the soil and then they invade the roots of the plant. And these fungi then, they build these exchange zones, which I've shown in red. And in those exchange zones, they're able to access the carbon that the plant has made, the fixed carbon. So in return for this carbon that the fungi take from the plant, the fungi will give the plant resources that the fungus has gathered from the soil. These can be many things: water, phosphorus, nitrogen, other nutrients. Now, the plant is able to gather all those nutrients through its own roots, and so the plant doesn't need the fungus. However, the fungus is better at accessing those resources because it's finer. So the threads here, the mycelia, the hyphae, they are much finer, and so they can do a better job of extracting resources from the soil. And they will also extend further into the soil than the plant roots. So the moment that this fungus invades the plant root, this root now has access to all of the resources out here that the fungus is tapping into, as opposed to just what's in the neighborhood of that root. Okay, so I've got one fungus here, and the thick green lines are indicating that it's generous, and then another fungus here, and the thin green lines are indicating that it's not so generous. And so I have shown a plant here where it's doing the partner selection thing, where it gives a little to the fungus that gives a little, and gives a lot to the fungus that gives a lot. However, this would be what's called a split root design, where you have one fungus on one side, the other fungus on the other, and they're not mixed up at all. In this scenario, which experimentalists produce in the lab, so they can grow a plant with some sort of barrier in here that separates the roots and separates the fungi. And in this scenario, the plant can tell which fungus is good and which fungus isn't, and can allocate resources appropriately. So the plant is able to do partner selection. But in the real world, the one that I'm showing in this picture here, the plant roots are pretty mixed up from different plants, and the fungi are quite mixed up inside the plant roots. There is no separation. And so there is no mechanism anyone knows of at this point that would allow a plant to distinguish which fungus is giving it how much, give at the scale at which the fungi are mixed up in the plant roots. So we would like to show or understand how you can end up with a multi-partner mutualism, a stable multi-partner mutualism, without partner selection. Okay, so here are the main research questions. Can multiple, so AMF is the short form for these fungi, can multiple AMF coexist on one plant without partner selection? Can the wild community resist invasion by a less mutualistic fungi? This is actually where this research started, because Miranda Hart was interested in the consequences of releasing commercial AMF into the environment. So every time you go to the garden store and you buy a bag of soil that says it's got mycorrhiza or fungus or something like that in it, you are buying soil that has been inoculated with a commercial fungus. And as we are familiar with human agriculture, the number of species that we grow is much smaller than the number that nature produces. And so there are very few types of commercial fungus that are available. And so when we're buying that bag, when you buy that bag of soil with mycorrhiza in it, whether you buy it in Ireland or in Canada or somewhere else, it's probably got the same commercial fungus in it, or one of a very few types that are available. And so what we're doing is we're essentially setting up an invasion experiment where we are taking an alien species and introducing it into our gardens and into commercial agriculture, into the fields. So what's going to happen when this alien species is introduced? And the thing to remember is that the commercial fungus is grown in vitro. It's not grown in a scenario where it has to be a mutualist with a plant. It's just grown in a medium that keeps it happy. It's provided with the carbon that it needs, and is selected for producing lots of spores, because the more spores you have, the more you can propagate your commercial fungus and sell it. So this commercial fungus, and it's had several generations to evolve, is nothing like the wild fungus that it originally came from. So commercial AMF tend to reproduce really quickly. They produce a lot of spores. We don't know if they're good mutualists. The wild AMF reproduce slowly and grow slowly, and we know they're good mutualists, or a lot of them are. So what's going to happen when we introduce this commercial AMF to the system? So once we've answered question 1, we can look at question 2. And we will look at this question in a non-spatial system and in a spatial system. And then finally, in an evolutionary context, can we find mutualistic fungi evolving? Okay, so first question, can we get coexistence without partner selection? So this is the model we came up with. It's a consumer resource model. It's a fairly simple one. We have, so here's the plant equation, here's the fungal equation. I'll start with the fungal equation. It's a wee bit simpler. So the I is fungus I. So for each fungus, and this is, M is just the biomass, it grows because it receives carbon from the plant. The parameter beta tells you how good a mutualist the plant is. And this Q is a conversion factor, so it turns carbon into a unit that makes sense with fungal biomass. So growth of the fungus is delayed, the minus sign here, when it provides phosphorus to the plant. And alpha tells you how good a mutualist the fungus is. And then this term here is a maintenance cost. This is a letter S. We can have any number here as long as it's larger than 1. Okay, so the change in plant biomass equation is just like the fungal one, except the plant, we are assuming a scenario where one plant is associated with many fungi. So the phosphorus is received from all of the fungi, hence the sum here. And then the carbon is given to all of the fungi. So some term there as well. Here's the maintenance cost for the plant. Again, this power here can be any number larger than 1. And then here's the intrinsic growth. We will often set this R to the growth rate of the plant to 0 in the absence of the fungi, but we don't need to. And so we can check our results with this being non-zero as well. So the plant can grow in the absence of the fungus, but the fungus cannot grow in the absence of the plant. So the key point to notice here, and let's go back down to the fungus equation, is that this term saturates as the plant gets large, but this one does not. So, I mean, our thinking at the time was that, well, the plant tends to be bigger than the fungus, so we can't have the plant sucking everything out of the fungus. So when the plant gets really big, the fungus keeps giving phosphorus in proportion to its own biomass, but not in proportion to the plant biomass. The plant, however, keeps giving carbon in proportion to its own biomass and in proportion to the fungal biomass. And this creates an asymmetry in the way resources are exchanged. So I'm going to skip over the mathematical analyses. If you're interested, they're all in these papers. What I'm going to focus on in this talk is the results that come out of the analyses. And what we find in that model that I just showed you is that indeed we can have coexistence of all of these species. The order here is from most generous fungus to least generous fungus. So this would be the highest alpha and this would be the lowest alpha. And then this is the plant growth. And they all saturate at some level. So what's happening, it turns out, is that we've got indirect parasitism between the fungi. So the relationships that we model are these green arrows up at the top. So the plant gives to each of the fungi, and each of the fungi give to the plant. But then if we look at the indirect relationships that are set up between the fungi, we have these plus-minus relationships. So what's happening is one fungus is parasitizing another. So if we look at AMF1, for example, it's the most generous fungus. So it gives lots of resources to the plant, But that means the plant then has lots of resources to give to everybody. And so if AMF1 gives a lot to the plant, AMF2 benefits by receiving lots from the plant, but not giving quite so much. And so the relationship between these two ends up being one of indirect parasitism, where AMF1 is helping AMF2, but AMF2 is not helping AMF1. And the same for these other pairs. So, so there's no competition in this model. Here we find that we can have coexistence of all of these species. None of them are squeezed out. Because what we've got set up between them is this loop of indirect parasitism. And in this system, there's always room for another fungus. Okay. So now we want to get into the invasion models. But we know what we know is that, so our first model, we could have multiple partner coexistence. But we know that there has to be competition going on. And certainly when the invader comes in, there's going to be competition. So we're going to modify the model a little bit. We're going to now include competition between the mutualist partners. So here's the intrinsic growth rate of the plant. And then the rest of the model is the same as before, just now we're adding competition. Okay, so I think this should be a minus sign here, or the fungal maintenance that should be a negative term. Anyway, so here's the phosphorus received from the fungi given to the plant. And then here's the carbon supplied from the plant. That's the same as before. So these functions F, CP and FHP are the same functions as before. What I've done is added a competition term. So now the carbon, what's happening is the carbon from the plant, all the different fungi need to compete for it. And so the amount they receive is reduced by this competition term. So when we go to the fungal equation, so we have this is the maintenance term, which I said should have a minus sign in front. Here is the carbon received from the plant, which is reduced because of competition. And then here is the phosphorus supplied to the plant. And we chose a competition term of this form. So when the fungal biomass is large, then this is roughly 1. And there's not much competition. So once the fungus gets big, it's able to outcompete everybody else. But if the fungus is smaller, now this competition parameter starts to matter. And this, okay, I always have to remember, if A is large, oh, sorry, wait a minute. I said that backwards. If M is large, then this is near 0 and competition is really fierce. Which makes sense. If M is small, this A parameter matters. So large A means this ratio is near 0, and so there's very little competition. So this being 1 means that there's no reduction in the carbon supplied by the plant. If A is small, then this is closer to 1 and the competition is more fierce. So small a means high competition, large A means low competition. Okay, so what do we get with this model? And again, we're looking at wild AMF versus commercial AMF. So let's look at what happens with just 2 wild AMF. So if we have 2 wild AMF, then we have these 3 possible scenarios. And the thickness of these arrows indicates the strength of competition between them. So if they're both weak competitors, you have coexistence. If they're both strong competitors, we have competitive exclusion. And if only one is a strong competitor, we have competitive exclusion. All right, let's look at 3. So if we have 3 fungi, they can and they're all weak competitors, they can coexist. If they're all strong competitors, we have competitive exclusion. This is an interesting case. If you have two fungi that compete strongly and you add one that is a weak competitor, this weak competitor can mediate coexistence of these strong competitors, and we have coexistence of everybody. And the other cases down here all lead to competitive exclusion. So then if we think of a scenario where we have an invader, so MC is our commercial fungus, and a community of wild fungi. So we're only going to have a community if they're either all weak competitors, or, you know, a scenario like this where we've got weak competitors mediating coexistence of stronger competitors. So if we assume that we're in the scenario where there is a wild community and we add a commercial invader, and these are steady state results, so we're not looking at the invasion process here, just at steady state, what happens. So in this case, if we have a community of weak competitors and a strongly competing commercial fungus, then the commercial fungus will exclude everybody else. If the commercial is a weak competitor, then we have coexistence of everybody. If the community they compete weakly amongst each other, but strongly against the invader, and the invader competes strongly too, then we have this bistability scenario where we don't know if it's the commercial fungus or the wild community that's going to win. And then if the community competes strongly with the commercial invader and the invader competes weakly with the wild community, then the wild community wins. Okay, so that's steady state. And we can determine the conditions under which we get the transition from one of these scenarios to the other. So notice that the strength of competition here matters. So, and remember that large A reduces competition. So the smaller A is, the higher the competition. So the minimal competition strength the community must exert on the invader to overcome an invasion of the alien species is given by this, this ratio here, this equation here. And what I want to draw your attention to this part of the equation, which says that this number gets larger when the wild community is larger. So the bigger your wild community, the higher this value of A. Remember, higher A means less competition. So you don't need to be as competitive if the community is larger. Okay. So if we go back to those scenarios where we had a community competing with the commercial invader, then we have these four cases where we could have the alien species win, we could have coexistence, we could have exclusion of either the wild community or the invader, or we can just have the native community winning. So this parameter here that I just showed you is shown here. And so remember that if the wild community is larger, then the value of this AWC star goes up. So here's this arrow here. So if you increase the diversity of the community, then this dividing line moves up, and you are more likely to have these cases than these upper cases. And if we look at the cases at the bottom, that you're going to end up with, so the native community wins, or if the community is large, you're more likely to end up with the native community winning than the commercial fungus winning. And at the same time, the other thing I should point out here is that if the commercial fungus is a very bad mutualist, then that will decrease the value of this A star, and so that moves the line down. Okay, so what we get from this is that a more diverse wild community is better protected against invasion, and a mutualist, a commercial fungus that is a really poor mutualist, is harder to resist. Okay, so now let's look at the spatial case, where now we introduce a little bit of the commercial fungus in part of the domain and see what happens. So again, it's the same model as before. So these are the equations you saw before, and I've got two equations for the fungi now because I've got one for the commercial fungus and one for all the wild fungi. And it's possible that the commercial and wild fungi diffuse at different rates, particularly since the commercial fungus sporulates so readily. These spores, they can get carried through the soil by moisture. The animals and insects will carry them to different parts of the domain as well. And so it's entirely possible that this commercial fungus spreads more quickly than the wild fungi. Okay, so these H terms are the same as before, and all we've done is add diffusion to the fungi, not the plants. Okay, so we have the same four outcomes from our steady-state non-spatial analysis. So we either have coexistence of everybody, the wild fungi excluding the invader, the commercial fungus excluding the wild community, or this bistability scenario where it could go one way or the other. These waves, I'm not sure why Maria did this, so some of them are going to the right and some of them are going to the left, but the arrow always tells you which way to look. So behind the arrow is the steady state afterwards, and in front of the arrow we always have just a tiny bit of the commercial fungus and a healthy wild community. And what we see in all of these cases is that the plant does best when there is a diverse community of fungi. So the more fungi there are, the better the plant does. So this is the case that results in coexistence. They're all weak competitors, and so the commercial fungus becomes part of the wild community, and the plant does better because now it's got more fungi that it can access. When the community survives, so this is behind the wave, the plant, okay, so in this case, the initial condition here is very little wild community and a lot of commercial fungus. That's one side. And then behind the wave, the community has excluded the commercial fungus and the plant is coexisting with the wild community. So the plant does better with the wild community than it does with the commercial fungus because here it has only one fungus and here it has a whole wild community. And similar story with these two scenarios. Okay, now back to this diversity conclusion that we came up with earlier. We find that if we have just one wild fungus, then the commercial fungus can either exclude the wild fungus, that's what's happening in this case, or join up with the wild fungus. In either case, the commercial fungus establishes. But if there are two wild AMF already, then we can obtain scenarios where they exclude the commercial fungus. They either exclude it or coexist with it, but they do not get excluded themselves. So diversity resists invasion. In the bistability case, not surprisingly, Propagule pressure matters. And so if the commercial fungus, this is this red here, is introduced over just part of the domain, and we've got plant and fungus at low levels across the domain, think of maybe these are neighboring agricultural fields where one of them has got the commercial fungus introduced and the others don't, but it's springtime and the plants and the fungi are at low levels. Then as everything grows, this commercial fungus begins to invade, but at the same time, the wild community and plants are growing. And if the domain is large enough, they're able to establish and push that invading wave of commercial fungus back, and the wild community wins. However, if there is on a smaller domain, or if there's more inoculant, more of the commercial fungus added, then the commercial fungus takes over. Okay, so far we've found that diversity of wild fungi protects against invasion, and that if we want to be sure that we aren't going to lose any of our wild community, then we want a commercial fungus that's weakly competitive. So what about evolution? And this is really just a teaser. We're working on this right now. We've been working on it for a while, and it turns out to be harder than we thought. So I'm just going to show you a couple of results that we've come up with. I mean, it's all well and good to say that we can, at steady state, we have a community of mutualists that coexists stably, that has stable coexistence, or that if the quality of plants and fungi as mutualists are fixed, that we can obtain the results that I just showed you for invasion. But what if the mutualist quality of the plants or the fungi can evolve? Would we actually end up with good mutualists or not? So this is the first model we wrote down. And it's basically the same model as before, okay? But now we're allowing the fungi to have an alpha parameter. That is a measure of how generous they are, an alpha parameter that changes. So that complicates the equation, right? Because now we have to integrate across alpha. This is the phosphorus given to the plant, and so we sum across all the different alpha fungi that are available, and then this is the carbon given to all the different fungi with their different values of alpha, and then same terms over here. And the maintenance terms, these maintenance terms, we need some sums as well. Okay, so same model as before, but now allowing alpha, and we're just diffusing it. So what do we get if we run that model? So what we find, this is the mean trait. So we take the weighted integral here of all of the fungi, and we find that the mutualist quality first increases, then decreases, and settles down to something that is low, but is most distinctly not zero. And if we look at the end, so toward the end of the simulation, at the distribution of alpha traits across all the fungi, we have a lot of poor mutualists, but we have a few very, very good mutualists. So, I mean, in nature, we're pretty sure that the curve should be a little more this way. So we have a ways to go. We don't understand, we can't explain how good mutualists would evolve, or a large number of good mutualists would evolve in this system. But we're encouraged by the fact that we are getting good mutualists evolving, if only a few. If we include spatial spread, where now we've got, so here, this is the diffusion in the mutualism trait. And then we add diffusion, so movement in space. So if you remember back to competitive exclusion, spatial heterogeneity, so if we include space in the model, the competition colonization trade-off, we can get coexistence. And so this is essentially looking at that scenario. Whoops, where'd the figure go? Well, the figure's gone. But what we find is that we have better mutualists at the front of the wave than at the back of the wave. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you found this interesting.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. That was really, really good. Thank you so much. I would just invite the floor now for questions. I know I have a few questions of my own, but anybody would have a question for Rebecca now?